Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on the Doctors of the Church with St. Albert the Great. But first, I have to mention that as I record this, Pope Leo has just declared a new Doctor of the Church, St. John Henry Newman. So now we're going to be up to 38 Doctors of the Church. And I'm very happy about this because I'm a huge fan of St. John Henry Newman and of what he stands for and what he wrote. He was definitely on my short list of people who should be doctors but aren't yet. Now, what St. Anthony of Padua was to the Franciscans and to St. Bonaventure, St. Albert the Great was to the Dominicans and to St. Thomas Aquinas. But in this case, the influence was more direct, since Albert the Great was actually St. Thomas's teacher. In each case, the student surpassed the teacher, and you know we will be getting to Saints Bonaventure and Aquinas very soon. But for this month, let's talk about St. Albert the Great. St. Albert was one of those people who could get so caught up in a task, in his case, research and writing, that he is unaware of the passage of time. He once wrote, "I have often spent the whole night like this, never suspecting that even 2 hours of the night had passed." Now, it's important to keep in mind that throughout the lives of the last several Doctors of the Church, from St. Bernard of Clairvaux right on through to St. Thomas Aquinas, this 200-year span of time was dominated by two things: the struggle for power between the Church and the secular rulers, and the Crusades. And like some of the doctors before him, St. Albert would be called upon to be a mediator between enemies, and also to preach in support of the Crusades. In fact, the popes used the Dominicans as recruiters for the Crusades. Now, the Crusades could easily take up 2 episodes of this podcast, but we're not planning to do that because that would be too much of a tangent from the Way of the Fathers. Suffice it to say, as I tell my students, that they started it. The First Crusade was a response to Islamic colonialism, piracy, and terrorism. And as a crusade, it was successful. But it was all downhill from there. And there were things that went wrong, and mistakes were made. And by the time of the 8th and last crusade, well, perhaps St. Albert's heart wasn't in it, and he wasn't very successful in drumming up support or recruits. Albert von Bollstadt was born in Lauingen, Bavaria, around the turn of the 13th century, probably in the year 1206, though some say that his last name was Lauingen and he was born in 1193. He was the eldest son of a family from the lower nobility, so, like St. Bernard, he could have had a career as a knight. He certainly seems to have grown up with a life of privilege, occupying his time with things like falconry. But he began his studies with an uncle in Padua, though this was probably before there was a formal university there. So this actually would have been before St. Anthony was at Padua. St. Albert was there as a kid, before it was a university. St. Anthony was there as a professor, after it was a university. In any case, it was at Padua where young Albert came into contact with the Dominicans. He wanted to join, but he worried that it would be hard for him to live the vow of obedience. After all, when you're a genius like he was, you know that it's unlikely that your religious superiors will also be your intellectual superiors. His uncle also discouraged him from making a quick decision to join. But in the end, he consecrated himself to Our Lady, confident in her intercession to help him fulfill his vows. And so he joined the Dominicans. Some sources say in the year 1223, at the age of about 16 or 17. Others say a bit later, in 1229, at the age of about 23. Either way, this puts him in that first generation of Dominicans, just like St. Anthony of Padua was in that first generation of Franciscans. And so it seems that once he joined the Dominicans, he was sent back to his home province to continue his studies at Cologne. At some point, Albert was ordained a priest and became a professor at the Dominican Priory of Hildesheim, before being sent back to Cologne to teach there. From there, he went to Regensburg, and then Strasbourg, and then Paris. So, very much like St. Anthony of Padua was a teacher of the Franciscans, so St. Albert of Cologne, as he was sometimes known back then, was a teacher of the Dominicans. And it was at the University of Paris where he would meet his most famous student, his apprentice, really, St. Thomas Aquinas. But he wasn't there all that long. In 1245, the year before Aquinas arrived in Paris, Albert had earned the Master of Theology diploma, kind of like our doctorate. And then 3 years later, he became the rector of the Dominican University in Cologne. Thomas Aquinas went with him to Cologne to continue studying under him. Now, you may be aware of the story that St. Thomas Aquinas was once called by a nickname by his fellow students. They called him the dumb ox because he was apparently quiet and maybe kind of big. Well, it was St. Albert the Great who said to them something to the effect of, "You call him a dumb ox, but the day will come when the whole world will hear the lowing of his teaching." In 1254, at the age of 48, St. Albert was made the provincial prior of the Dominicans of all of Central Europe. And after 4 years in that position, he was back as rector of Cologne, and he would be instrumental in formalizing the course of study there. In 1260, at the age of 54, he was appointed as a bishop by the Pope. He tried to refuse the position, and in fact, he received a letter from a friend begging him to refuse the position. The letter said that for him to accept the position of bishop would set a bad precedent, because people might begin to see the vocation of friar as a stepping stone to positions of power in the church. Not to mention that it would be very difficult to live the life of a friar with all that administrative responsibility. His friend wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, "I would rather go to your funeral than see you elevated to bishop." And actually, refusing the office of bishop was kind of common back then. I'll probably say this again when we get to it, but they will try to make Thomas Aquinas bishop of several different cities, and he will refuse them all. Still, there were perfectly good Dominican bishops, and so Albert felt that he had to accept. It seems he felt that to refuse would be a mortal sin, because it would be an act of disobedience to the Pope. 2 years later, in 1262, he tried to retire. But within a year, he was the papal nuncio for Northern Europe. And in this role, he was often called upon to negotiate peace between feuding lords. Eventually, the Pope asked him to go on a preaching tour to promote the crusade, but as I mentioned, in this he had very little success. He was also present at the 14th Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Lyon, in the year 1274. This council was convened to try to reunite the Eastern Church with the West, now 2 centuries after the mutual excommunication had led to the schism. But nothing really came of that. For the most part, after his short stint as a bishop, he went back to teaching, ending up again at Cologne. St. Albert actually outlived his more famous student by a few years. It is said that when he heard of Aquinas' death, Albert wept openly, to the point where rumors were started about him becoming senile. Now, St. Thomas had died in the year 1274, but he was posthumously taking heat for some of his writings, and he was being criticized by the Archbishop of Paris. And so, in 1277, at the age of 71, St. Albert went to Paris to defend Thomas's teachings, and he was able to quiet the criticisms. Now, full disclosure, some scholars question whether Albert actually made the trip, suggesting perhaps that he was too old and that he sent something in writing instead. Either way, the aging St. Albert successfully defended Aquinas' teaching. After this, though, there may be some truth to the story that his memory was fading, and he may also have been losing his sight. And so it seems that he retired from teaching at about this time. And he died 3 years later in 1280 on November 15th, which is his feast day. He was 74 years old when he died, though some sources say he was over 80, which is why there is some discrepancy about the year of his birth. But within a generation or two of his death, he was already being called Albertus Magnus, or in English, Albert the Great. Now you might think, who could ever dislike the friars? But it turns out there was a major controversy in the 1250s. The secular clergy, what we would call the diocesan clergy, opposed the mendicant orders, both Dominicans and Franciscans. A pamphlet written against the friars found its way to the Pope, and St. Albert, as well as Saints Bonaventure and Aquinas, weighed in on the validity of the ministry of the mendicant orders. Now, a big part of the criticism was that in the universities, the friars were studying Aristotle, and they were reading books by Jewish and Muslim scholars. And so there was a lot of criticism of especially the Dominicans for being too interested in non-Christian philosophy. The critics all but quoting the old adage of Tertullian, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" But it was St. Albert the Great who was able to win the day in favor of the friars and calm the Pope's fears about what was going on in the universities. And at least for a little while, the heat was off. St. Albert was at heart a man of prayer, exemplifying the patristic and medieval conviction that no one can really do theology unless it is done within a life of prayer. He said that whenever he couldn't understand something by studying it, he would take it to prayer, and there he found the understanding that study alone could not give him. And it was said that he prayed all 150 psalms every day. St. Albert was also an outdoorsman, which led him to want to study creation. He said, "The whole world is theology for us, because the heavens proclaim the glory of God." It's been said that he preferred to walk everywhere rather than ride in a carriage, even as a bishop when he had to visit all the parishes in his diocese. But other sources indicate that this was actually a rule for the Dominicans, that as part of their vocation of humility, they were not allowed to ride. The rule may have also been a way to avoid being robbed, because they were also not allowed to carry money, though they would say that they were simply following Jesus' command to carry no bag. And so when Albert was provincial, if any of his priors arrived at a meeting in a carriage or on a horse, he made them do penance for their pride and their sloth. Behind his back, they called him Bishop Boots. But again, the sources don't agree about whether this was because of his habit of walking everywhere or because of some literal boots that he wore. But the reason the walking thing is important for St. Albert is that he used his walks all over Europe to study and catalog all the plant and animal life. Like several of our doctors, St. Albert was a harsh critic of the lords and other nobles who lived lives of luxury and engaged in warfare as a form of entertainment while the peasants worked themselves to death. And yet, like St. Bernard of Clairvaux, he was often called upon to mediate between them, and he was quite successful as a peacemaker, because even though he was a harsh critic of the nobles, they trusted him. Everyone trusted him because of his reputation for no compromise holiness. And so he often functioned as a kind of papal ambassador, even when he didn't hold that position officially. And it was also said that in his later life, in the priory at Cologne, he would remember his mortality by visiting, every day, the place where he knew he would one day be buried. Albert the Great was, for all intents and purposes, beatified in 1484, when Pope Innocent VIII authorized his veneration. But he was more officially beatified in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV, though it seems that he was never officially canonized until, in 1931, Pope Pius XI declared him canonized, confirmed his feast day, and declared him a doctor of the Church. He's called the Universal Doctor because he studied and mastered virtually every known science and philosophy. He is the patron of scientists and especially veterinarians. He is now entombed in the Church of St. Andrew in Cologne. St. Albert the Great, pray for us. Next time, on The Way of the Fathers, the legacy of St. Albert the Great. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.